Thanks again, Athar, for the presentation. And I guess I picked up on something this time, which I didn't pick up on last time, which was the way in which you understand sculpture. And it kind of reminded me actually of Tarkovsky's notion of filmmaking as sculpt in time, but maybe that's something we can discuss a bit later. I want to return to some questions which I asked you about previously, and I'm going to try to push you a bit more today on some of those questions which I asked previously of you. But I'd like to start where I've had a conversation with you before on, and I know you somewhat courageously, as I've described to you before, use the term violence to describe the work that you do. And not many people are quite happy to describe what they do as an act of violence. And I think that's, an important critical move. But I want to strip it back a bit and actually ask you just a straightforward question. What do you understand violence to mean?
Yes. Oh, Brett, thank you for being here and for the question. I've been trying to define violence during this 5 years to pinpoint a precise definition of violence. I've asked many people, and I think there are many different interpretations that one can have about violence. First of all, there is the unintentional violence. We've talked about this before. Nature also is violent, right? If you have an earthquake, a tsunami, a star exploding, that is also violence. But are we ready to perceive that as violence if it doesn't affect us, for example, right? A star exploding light years from here doesn't really affect us. So is it violent? No, actually, it's beautiful to look at, and we enjoy it in that way. It's a bit sublimized, if you want. But then, of course, living in our society, we have a more responsible. We need to take more responsibility in addressing violence and trying, hopefully, also to mitigate it as well. Our society is definitely violent, I think, and civilized society must be regulated, and it's connected to that regulation is violence. And we're talking here, of course, about systemic violence and structural violence. To me, this is how I perceive it. Also, when you feel violated, let's say, I think that it's more related to change. Okay, so you have something, a status quo of one thing, and whatever imposes a force on that thing, changing its status without it wanting to be changed, I think of that as violence. I don't know, maybe you can already give me some feedback on that, and then we can engage in a discussion. I don't...
Well, I think it kind of leads into this, I guess one of my concerns that I've had, and I've raised this with you before, about this idea that everything that's forceful is violence, right? So, and I think you use the word here, intention, and I'm thinking about this in the terms of the context of even what you do as an act of sculpting. I always saying, for instance, that a rock falling onto a rock and kind of breaks it is a form of violence, and then what you do is a form of violence, and everything we do that has a certain relationship to force is violence. So in that sense, why do we need even the term force, right? We might as well just call everything violence. And is there not therefore a danger by taking out this notion of intentionality, which can also allow us, as you I think do brilliantly in this talk, about saying, well, there's something different between destructive as opposed to creative. If we don't have a solid grasp of what intentionality means, then do we actually strip violence of its meaning? And I think that's where my kind of concerns come with this. So.
Yes, I totally agree. At a certain moment in this past 5 years, I saw everything as violence, right? Because progress, life is about change and entropy. So then there is a danger of seeing everything as violence, which, of course, it's not helpful in any way. But I think it's also related to who is on the receiving end of violence, right? There was something that made me think, reading Fanon and how violence is active on both sides, either the oppressive side or the liberatory side. I think that violence is perceived as such by who is on the receiving end of that violence. When you are committing a violent act, sometimes I think you are not aware of that, or you are doing it with noble purposes, let's say. Okay, the first colonialism started with allegedly noble causes but of course it turned out into violent development. Yeah, I think we have to separate the force, which is more natural causes that we might or might not define as violent, and then the violence that is injustice, that is oppressing the social system, and those are things that we can do something about it, of course. I don't know what.
But I think what you seem to be also be talking to you then, and I think it is important, as you suggest, to have a real kind of solid understanding in terms of, you know, the things that we name as violence. So how do we understand the very naming of violence? And I think what you kind of also suggesting here is kind of, you know, brings us through to the work of certainly people like Giorgio Agamben, and this understanding of maybe the distinction between exceptional violence and normalized violence, which is also there, of course, in the work of Judith Butler as well. And it's very easy to critique things which look exceptional in terms of violence, but, you know, but it's the things which are not even named as violence which become far more difficult and challenging for us to deal with. And I think you beautifully narrate that actually in your experience of, you know, going to school when you're a young child in Florence, and, you know, you're trying to kind of deal with this experience, but also there's this reality, right? So the normalization of violence and how that connects to the exceptional. And what I'm also just thinking in terms of your response then is, what you're really kind of pushing here is to try to say then, well, how does the stone see, or how does the stone feel? Right? Because this seems to be a phenomenological question, right? You know, how does a stone see the act of the brutality that you're bringing with your hammer and chisel? Is that what you're kind of reaching for in terms of maybe a phenomenology of stone in that way?
Yes, so of course it's divided in many ways. That we are talking now, I assume, about the gesture of stone carving, you know, the application of stone on the more abstract context, as I said. Well, we don't know if stone feels or doesn't have feelings, or whether this is something beyond our understanding. But I think there is something, I'm guilty of that as well. There is something incredibly arrogant about going on in a mountain and then chopping it apart, tearing it down just to embellish our houses or create representations of human figures. It's something very narrow-minded as well. But of course, maybe it's all we can do as humans. We want to represent ourselves within a very limited vision of time, and so this is what we do. I realized that I don't know what stone feels, but I do know that the gesture of stone carving is very violent in itself. Only because it changes the shape of something. We are at that moment, I am imposing my will on something that cannot backfire, cannot react, right? And I'm changing the shape of something with force. So in that sense, yes, that is definitely violent. But of course, there is not really an interaction here. So it becomes problematic. If I impose my will on you, there is something different, and how I do it. But I feel bad, when I have to say, when I carve, because this is a thing that has been developing for 300 million years old. Stone, marble is 300 to 350 million years old. Humanity wasn't even on this planet. And then we have, you know, again, the arrogance of taking it and just putting our own image in it. It's quite problematic. So I'm more interested on what it can mean in itself. So it's a very primitive feeling to that.
Well, I'm mindful, obviously, that the time is going, but there's one further point I really want to ask you about here, and I'm really kind of, I guess, compelled by the idea of seeing what you do as a form of sacrifice. And you talk about sacrifice, and I think it's from many of the kind of intellectual sources that you draw upon, particularly René Girard, I think it's fair to say that you are very much operating within a sacrificial image of thought, right? That you kind of work within this idea of the sacrifice. And through this, you kind of suggest that there could be a different relationship to stone, and you talk about the universality or the coming together, and almost kind of like the emancipatory potential of a different ethics towards stone. But this is what I have concerns, because René Girard and his commitment to the politics of sacrifice doesn't in any way attest the cycle of violence. It just simply regulates it. We just have to learn to regulate violence. So in terms of what you do and what you're trying to bring, where is the attesting of violence? And as I mentioned to you previously, are we not also endangered if we say art is sacrifice? The next step is to basically once again set up art as some kind of sacred object where the artist in themselves almost kind of embodies a theologian. So is there not an inherent danger of setting everything up as sacrificial as well?
Yes. What I like to think about is how in primitive times, there was a very fine line between shamanistic practices and artistic practice. What we today interpret as art, as primitive art, the cave paintings and other things, which are usually painted on rocks, we think of it as art, but actually they had a total different function, which was more a regulatory function, a cathartic function, and it was performed by people who had the authority to do that. It wasn't just anyone else. So the shaman and the artist were almost the same figure at that time, and art might have that function as well, a way of putting out things of the unconscious for society, but there is a danger, of course, especially when you then think about the contemporary art market, which has nothing to do with the more, let's say, mystical aspects of art making. And I think that contemporary art performances, most of the time, all have similar goals to it, goals of healing, let's say, society, the viewers. And the setting of contemporary performances is very similar to sacrificial setting. There is the artist and the public. As in ancient times, you have the sacerdotal figure and then the community that was witnessing what was happening on that altar. Definitely not all art has that, but when you are stressing the act of making, especially in the context, as I said it, on a stone altar, I couldn't not notice the similarities with sacrificial practices. And then on many levels, as I said, you have the physical level, but then you have the sacrifice of the image, which I think is very interesting. Which image do you pull out of the infinite possibilities? This is a selective act that I think is also very violent. And this is how the artwork works as well, right? Or the academic work. Someone gets selected at the cost of others. There is a limited space for people in this world. So, yeah, I think.
Yeah, well, I think, I think I maybe prefer Roncier's effacement of the image rather than the sacrifice of the image, but maybe that's, I'm sure we could carry on talking all afternoon about these. But yeah, thanks for your responses. And it just makes me feel as a final point about, this question of what crimes does the stone bear witness to? And I think there's something which I think is a nice way of ending perhaps our part here. So, but thanks for your responses, and I look forward to carrying on the discussion at a future time.
Brad, thank you for being here and for thinking together about this topic. It's a pleasure.